On the board, you'll notice it talks about religious experiences. Gotta get all the I's dotted here. Religious experiences. There's a lot of misunderstanding in our program about what the Big Book is about. There are a lot of times you'll go into a meeting and they'll say, well, this is not a religion. This is a spiritual program. Not a religious program. It's a spiritual program. Well, that's true to a degree. However, there are many, many places throughout the Big Book, starting on page 11, that it talks about religion. And we really kind of need to come to terms with that. Now, religion comes from a word, ligio, which is a Latin word for read. It means to read. Religio means to reread something. And there's a type of spiritual experience that occurs when we're reading something over and over again. You may have noticed that when you've read a book multiple times, things will just kind of jump out of the page. And yet you say to yourself, I've read this several times. Why didn't I ever notice that before? Well, that's a type of religious experience. And this has been known by, well, over the ages, by the ancients and so forth. So we're not down on the word religion. That's the first thing that we're going to look at is we're going to start agreeing with the Big Book instead of picking and choosing portions of it that we want to use. Now, over the years with Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous being overtaken by people that are not addicts, a lot of them are just heavy drinkers and heavy drug users, got carried away, disco drunks, I call them. But they show up and they start giving us information, the real alcoholic or addict, on how to sober up. Well, that's watered our program down a lot. Then the people that just want to pick and choose bits of information here and there, it's led to a situation where I can show up at a meeting fully ready to sober up. I mean, everything is in place. I'm beat down, I'm in a state of reasonableness, and get very little help, and sometimes even information that's not helpful at all. So we get into our literature thoroughly. Religious experiences. Well, William James, in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, describes a particular definition for religion. He talks about the first-hand religious experience. He makes it a very clear point that he's not talking about big organizations, that there are a lot of great organizations, and that the founders of most of these organizations had first-hand religious experiences. One of the first stories he talks about in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, is George Fox, who is the founder of the Quaker religion. And he goes into a deep explanation of what George Fox experienced as his awakening, and how he had this deep experience that later led to this very widespread religion of the day. And it seemed to be a very high quality religion. Each person that founded some type of religion or sect usually goes through the first-hand experience. Then along come the followers with the second-hand experience. A lot of times these are just normal kind of folks that say, this looks like a good deal, sign me up. I'm part of the membership. Now, I know it may feel like I'm losing you right now, but I'm not. We're just forming a foundation to understand who and what we are as alcoholics. So the first-hand spiritual experience or first-hand religious experience is what we're looking for. There are many varieties. We hear that in the appendix 2 of the Big Books of Alcoholics Anonymous, that most people get the educational variety, don't they? It says. Well, not all religious experiences are spiritual experiences. And this is something that's a hard-learned lesson for many people. Is a religious experience can be something as simple as I've found a new job and a new career. I love it. I've sobered up. I've made up my mind. I'm going to make good money. I'm going to do right, and I'm going to take care of my family. And it's really not a spiritual experience at all. It's a very material experience. Job, money, wife, family. I want to take care of those things. That's not a spiritual experience. Though, that religious experience may keep me sober for years and years. It often results in a dry drunk because it's not a spiritual experience. Life has certain low spots and challenges that the material type of religious experience does not solve. You know, we may lose a loved one and it deeply emotionally hurt us. Or we may lose that job and it create deep emotional pains for us because we were so reliant on it. Or perhaps we had amassed quite a savings over the years, our retirement, and then the market crashes. And that was our experiences. Is I've got all this money now, and I've put a lot of reliance on that money and how I was going to retire and had my plans, and it's all gone now. Material religious experiences do not do the same thing as a genuine spiritual experience. So that's kind of what the big book gets around to. Now, you might say, well, I haven't really read that part of the big book. Well, that's probably true because we don't talk about it a lot in meetings. And there aren't a whole lot of sponsors that take you through that big book real carefully. We do a lot of that around here, by the way. So we're talking about spiritual versus religious. Now, we would like to have a religious experience that is spiritual. We want our spirituality to be religious with us. What we don't want is a material experience to be religious. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in our life. Here are my glasses. And I'm going to touch on a couple of things out of this book, Varieties of Religious Experience. We're going to talk a little bit, just a general overview of the varieties and their titles. Let me dog ear page here so I can come back to it easily. Okay, I'm just going to touch base on a few of them. We have saintliness as a type of spiritual experience. We study about that a lot. And in our society, this is considered one of the premier types of spiritual and religious experience that we have. We see it a lot with our heavy-duty religions that try to get us sanctified. That means what we're doing in saintliness is we're relinquishing a lot of the things of the world so that our primary focus is on a spiritual power, an unseen spiritual power. It has a lot of history of proving to work in people's lives. However, it's not the only kind of spiritual experiences and religious experiences that are out there. We have a healthy-mindedness type of spiritual experience that's out there. We have positiveness. These are situations you've probably heard some people talk about. Well, always think positive. Don't even use negative words in your vocabulary. That kind of approach is another approach. Then we have people that are more focused on nature and so forth, that really look at nature from a religious standpoint. Then we have the people like I mentioned earlier, their work, their job, their politics become their religion. And we have a whole lot of that in our country and in our world today. Then we have general philosophies, religious philosophies that we have. And then we have mysticism. Now, mystical spiritual experiences actually are the core of all spiritual and religious experiences. But we first have to understand what is a mystical spiritual experience. Well, mystical spiritual experience is basically a deep inward feeling where our feelings have changed. And it's such a deep feeling that we'll never forget what it is. Our book refers to this on page 54. We'll read a little bit about that. It's the first full paragraph on page 54 for those of you who have your books open up. It says, "We found too that we have been worshipers. What a state of mental gooseflesh that used to bring on. Have we not variously worshipped people, sentiment, things, money, ourselves? And then with a better motive, had we not worshipfully beheld the sunset, the sea, or a flower? Who of us had not loved something or somebody? How much did these feelings, these loves, these worships have to do with pure reason? Little or nothing we saw at last. Were not these things the tissue of which our lives were constructed? Did not these feelings, after all, determine the course of our existence? It was impossible to say we had no capacity for faith or love or worship. In one form or another, we had been living by faith and little else." There's a lot of meaning behind this page. For it to be a page that's left out of almost every AA meeting and topic, it really contains an enormous amount of meaning. First off, it talks about worshipfully beholding things. And he gave us some examples. It talks about money, sentiment, things, ourself. Then it says with a better motive, the sea or a flower. Kind of like sitting out at the beach, right? And you're just like, whoa, that deep inward feeling that there's something bigger, more powerful. Well, that's a mystical experience. That feeling you had when you were first aware that if you had money, it would give you power. And, kind of that deep inward, I want that. To this day, some of us could still look at just a picture of a stack of money and we'll have a reaction. I want that. Or the nice car. Or a variety of ways. Well, those are spiritual experiences. It's changing our spirit. So, what we're doing right now is we're starting to get down to the nuts and bolts of what spirituality is, which is not superstition. A lot of people get spirituality confused with superstition. And I'd say that Hollywood's probably had a lot to do with that over the last century, feeding us all of this information about, ghost and goblin type spirits and a variety of things. But throughout history, when we're referring to spirituality, we are actually referring, in many cases, to emotions, the unseen world. And they're very real things, right? Feelings are not always reality, but they sure are real. So we're going to look at William James. This is his book, Variety of Religious Experience. We're going to look at the 4 things that are identifiers of a mystical spiritual experience. Because we've all had one of these, so deep that it took over our life. Number 1, it's described by ineffability. There are 4 factors here. Ineffability, without me reading the whole thing here, just to kind of give you in a nutshell what it means. Mystical states are more like states of feeling than like states of intellect. We just read that in the big book, didn't we? Okay. Well, this is, by the way, this is the first book that Bill Wilson read while he was still in Towns Hospital. This is where a lot of our information came from. And then we followed up with the Bible and him and Dr. Bob getting into that. It has a notic quality. They are states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by discursive intellect. It's true to me. Now, I can't really explain it to you, but it's true to me. It's a mystical state. It's a feeling that I can't explain. But it's really important to me. Transiency. Mystical states cannot be sustained for long. They're temporary. It means if I get a mystical state going on, it's probably going to last, as it describes in this book, an hour or two. They don't go much longer than that. It says they fade. Passivity. It says, yet when the characteristic sort of consciousness once has set in, the mystic feels as if his own will were in abeyance, and indeed sometimes as if he were grasped and held by a superior power. Those are the 4 characteristics of a mystical spiritual experience. Now we're going to jump over here and we're going to talk about one kind. There are many other kinds. Obviously, I'm not going to read the whole book this morning or even major portions of it. We're going to talk about one type of spiritual experience that applies to us. It says, in a recital like this, there is certainly something suggestive of pathology. The next step into mystical states carries us into a realm of public opinion and ethical philosophy that public opinion and ethical philosophy have long since branded as pathological, though private practice and certain lyric strains of poetry seem still to bear witness to its ideality. I refer to the consciousness produced by intoxicants and anesthetics, especially by alcohol. The sway of alcohol over mankind is unquestionably due to the power to stimulate the mystical faculties of human nature, usually crushed to earth by the cold facts and dry criticisms of the sober hour. Sobriety diminishes, discriminates, and says no. Drunkenness expands, unites, and says yes. It is in fact the great exciter of the yes function in man. It brings its votary from the chill periphery of things to the radiant core. It makes for him, for the moment, one with truth. Not through mere perversity do men run after it. To the poor and unlettered, it stands in place of symphony, concerts, and literature. And it is part of the deeper mystery and tragedy of life that whiffs and gleams of something that we immediately recognize as excellent should be vouchsafed to so many of us who in the fleeting earlier phases of what in its totality is so degrading and poisoning. The drunken consciousness is one bit of the mystic consciousness, and our total opinion of it must find its place in our opinion of the larger whole. So what happened? We're traipsing along in life. We're not really satisfied with life. This is before we've ever had a drink or a drug. And we're noticing that we're, like Dr. Silkworth says, irritable, restless, discontent. And on page 50, it tells us we're making heavy going of life. Page 51 of the big book, it tells us living was unsatisfactory.
Laying aside the drink question.
Laying aside the drink question. So this is all happening before we took the first drink. We're kids at this point. Mm-hmm. So visualize that. You're a kid traipsing along in life. You're dissatisfied. You're making heavy going of life. You're irritable. You're restless. You're discontent. The sober hour has hit you, as he described. Sober says no. So, somewhere along the way, because of events, we discover the yes function in man. And it comes in a bottle. It usually says Jim Beam or Jack Daniels. Or maybe it comes in a white powder or is rolled up like a cigarette. Whatever that yes function is that you found, it was like, yes, I can do this now. I got past the sober hour. There's no telling how many lives this stuff has saved over the years, because I don't know how long you can go in the irritable, restless, discontent thing without some of us just losing it and saying, I'm not doing this deal called life. It's heavy going. So we discovered a mystical, spiritual experience. It became our religion, whether we wanted it to or not. Now, we can claim to be Christians after we've smoked some crack cocaine, but we're actually practicing crack cocaineism, and that's our new religion, or alcoholism, which actually I categorize all of that stuff as alcoholism, simply because that's kind of the catch-all phrase for this disease. But that's our new religion. Now, unless a spiritual experience that is of a comparable quality takes place, then it remains our religion. And what happens is we'll go to a treatment center or we'll go to a facility and they don't understand this stuff. They haven't read varieties of religious experience, even though you would think, since we've got a big book and it kind of solved a lot of this dilemma many, many years back, they would all get into that. But they, like all human beings, they get back to some other things and they start teaching us a misinformation that you need to get sober. Well, I already tried that. I tried it for years. I was sober for many years before I took my first drink. You need to get sober, and if you get sober, somehow your life's going to get better. Is that kind of the message we get at our treatment centers?
Yeah.
Well, see, that's not the case, is it? Because once I get sober, I get the sober hour back on me at some point, and I get the no function, and that's not going to work for very long, and so I have to go back to my original religion, which is such a deep religion. You know how we've all heard about stories of martyrs throughout the years, being willing to get their head cut off for their religion, for their spirituality. Well, see, we're that way about our religion, too. You didn't realize you were that religious, did you? But you're willing to go get your head cut off to pursue your religion, which is a mystical, spiritual experience. That's why we will go out and do awful things, like take the money that was meant to pay the rent and buy the kids groceries and go spend it. We're willing to die for our religion, just like the Christian martyrs were. So you're a mystic martyr. You didn't even know it. Now you're starting to understand, if you follow me, what religion is and what it means to have a genuine spiritual experience, because everyone in this room has had such a deep and profound spiritual experience that you're willing to die for your religion. So what are we doing here? Well, we're probably not going to be able to really go back permanently to a material religious experience and permanently just, go to work, the hardworking, normal man kind of thing. That's probably not going to work. It may work for a long time. But along with that comes irritable, restless, discontent. How many years can we be irritable, restless, and discontent without running the wife off anyway? Without punching the boss in the nose? I mean, things are going to get bad. It's only so many hours, so many days that we can live that way before things are going to get bad anyway. In my case, it was 12 years. 12 years of dry time, and I was ready to commit suicide. I mean, that's where I was at. Because I'd had a religious experience. I had a religious experience with the ability to make about $25,000 a month. And that was my religion. And I had this sentiment that it talks about, you know, for my family. I had 8 little old kids running around, loved them. Had a lot of sentiment going on. And things, I had a beautiful lake house and fancy cars and stuff. And people, they all respected me. Because I'd go into our AA rooms and I'd talk a bunch of this psychobabble nonsense. And they just loved it. I was making no sense at all. I didn't know it. It all made sense to me. And I was almost like a celebrity. And we were in this AA club that was so watered down, it was pathetic. And we were all just kind of growing sick together. And it's still over there right across town. And they're still growing sick together. But thank God that I talked to a couple of people in the know that were not from this region. One of them's from Arkansas and another one came here from Andrews. And I prayed, and I just by God's grace, I opened my mind a little bit to investigate what real AA is about. And it hasn't stopped since then. That was about 3.5 years ago. And I've got to tell you, there's just a huge difference in what a true spiritual program is versus that other thing, whatever it was, my material religious experience. So I went through a conversion, is what happened. I converted from a material life to a spiritual life. Now we read about this on page 84, where it says, we've entered the world of spirit. Because, you know, I was at a point I was going to kill myself or take a drink. Something wasn't going to work well. Or I was going to have a conversion. And I'm one of the fortunate few that had a conversion instead of a drink. Or instead of putting a gun up to my face and pulling the trigger. So, what does that mean? That means I found a sufficient substitute. On page 151 and 152 it tells me, but do you have a sufficient substitute? So let's look at a little bit of that. So we can actually see the words here.
We just quote it for you.
What?
So we could just quote it for you.
Well, I'm just, instead of me just quoting out of the book or read a little bit, so.
It says, yes, it's vastly more than that. It's a fellowship. It's a fellowship.
Well, first I mentioned page 84, right? Let's look at what page 84 says. And we're on the second paragraph. It says, this thought brings us to step 10, which suggests we continue to take personal inventory and continue to set right any new mistakes as we go along. We vigorously commence this way of living as we cleaned up the past. We have entered the world of spirit, of the spirit. Our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. Well, we're really asking a question of ourselves. What does entering the world of spirit mean? What's surprising is you won't hear many people bring that up in AA meetings. Out of the, maybe 6,000 AA meetings I've been to in my life, it's probably been brought up once or twice. Of 6,000. And I think I brought it up one of those times. And one of my sponsees brought it up the other. Entering the world of spirit means that we're looking at things entirely differently. That no longer am I under a delusion that if I manipulate my material world, that somehow my spiritual world, my emotional world, will take care of itself. That was my previous set of beliefs, right? If I get my material needs met, if I set up my stage for life with all the goodies that I want, then somehow my spiritual life is going to be taken care of. In other words, we hear it all the time, man, if I get that car, I'll be happy. See, the happy part, that's the spiritual part. The car, that's the material part. and the material doesn't lead to the spiritual. In fact, it's quite the opposite, isn't it? So let's go on and read a little bit more. We have entered the world of the Spirit. Our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. This is not an overnight matter. It should continue for a lifetime. Continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. When these crop up, we ask God at once to remove them. We discuss them with someone immediately, make amends quickly if we have harmed anyone. Then we resolutely turn our thoughts to someone we can help. Love and tolerance of others is our code. Now there are 5 things that it's told us to do here. One is watch for these things. That means we've got to stay at a vantage point. That doesn't mean we wait until it's overtaken our life. The resentment is on us. It means we're watching for it to arrive. I'm on the watch. Mark Houston said, you can meditate on the word watch for 6 months. I did. It took on a new meaning. What watch means. One word. Watch means I watch for this stuff. I want it way down there and to see it coming before it gets up on me. Now, when I watch for it, then I have some clear-cut instructions on what I do to live in this world of the Spirit. Because I'm watching for the spirits. I'm watching for the evil spirit of resentment to show up. I'm watching for the evil spirit of fear to show up. I'm watching for the evil spirit of selfishness to show up. I am watching for the evil spirit of dishonesty to show up. These are the spirits. These are the ones that are ready to take us down. So they're not Hollywood little goblins. I now know their names. I've got them identified. I can apprehend these spirits now. As long as I was under this delusion that they're little unidentifiable goblins that show up out of nowhere and overtake me, I was powerless to do anything about them. But now I've been given the power by the grace of God to deal with them. And it tells me right here what I do. Well, when they do crop up, little old guy's coming along. His name is resentment. He's an evil spirit. Well, I ask God at once to remove this guy. I discuss it with someone immediately. So I immediately go defuse the situation by talking to someone. Doesn't say I have to go to my sponsor. Doesn't say I have to wait till tomorrow. In fact, it tells me something that's far more important than who it is. It's when do I do it? And that's immediately. It means I got to talk about it now. Hopefully within the same few minutes of that emotion coming my direction. I make amends quickly if I've hurt anyone. So if I did say something that harmed someone, I quickly make emotions. I don't wait until tomorrow. That means if I've harmed anyone, that doesn't mean, I've got to see blood, does it? It means if I've cut somebody down, if I've criticized someone, and it's hurt their esteem, then I've got to make amends right then. You know how we cut each other down with these cut down jokes? Most of those need an amend. And that needs to become part of the past. Hurting people is hurting people.
I mean, in the big book, it kind of reiterates that fact 2 other times. It says one word can raise the very devil, and it also says that alcoholics are sensitive people. It says that.
Very good.
Yeah. And to justify, if you're sensitive, that's your problem. Not when they go stick a needle in their arm and they're dead. It's everybody's problem. And it's my problem because I'm going to have to answer to my Creator for that. So, yeah, taking lightly hurting people is not what we do. So we make amends quickly and we get in the habit of it. If we form bad habits throughout our lifetime, remember back on page 27, it says our ideas, emotions, and attitudes have to completely change. That's got to go. My job is to get through this day without hurting anyone, without feeling any resentment, selfishness, fear, or dishonesty. And then finally, I'm to turn my thoughts to someone I can help. That doesn't mean I just have to immediately sit down with somebody and start working the steps. But what it does mean is I have to turn my thoughts to somebody that I can help. Got to think about maybe the guy that's in the sober house that's having a difficult time. Or maybe think about the people over at the treatment center that could use the full message of recovery and what Bill Wilson was talking about. And even allude to the fact that they would want to read the varieties of religious experience. Which I don't really recommend you run out and read that, for the first year or so. Stick with the big book. But, yeah, it's a good idea to know where this stuff came from. Now, let's look at page 151. Actually, it's on 152, I believe.
Yeah, it is. You were close, though.
It says here on the first full paragraph of 152, we have shown how to get out from under, you say. You say, yes, I am willing. But am I to be consigned to a life where I shall be stupid, boring, and glum, like some righteous people I see? I know I must get along without liquor, but how can I? Have you a sufficient substitute? It says it right there. I need to get along without liquor, but do you have a substitute for liquor? And the answer is yes. And it says a fellowship in Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, we talked a little bit about where that might be a problem, considering Alcoholics Anonymous has gotten watered down. At the time this book was written, remember the fellowship had come together. They were all talking, they were communicating, and they decided they had such a good thing going, they needed to write it down. So the book and the fellowship were identical at the time this book rolled off the press. Today, the fellowship is not anything like that book. We talked a little bit about that earlier, how rarely you'll hear somebody talk about entering the world of the Spirit, or talking about religion, talking about the many things that are contained in this book that are not mentioned in meetings. So we have to get back to the book, don't we? That's kind of, do we have a sufficient substitute? Yes. It also tells us that any two people getting together can call themselves an AA group. Well, it makes a lot more sense for two people that are in this book to get together and talk about recovery than to make it to the 75-man meeting down the road where they don't talk about recovery, or it's a bunch of psychobabble going on in there. The number of people at an AA meeting does not determine one iota of how good that meeting is. Some of the biggest meetings I've been to were some of the most watered down. There are people out there, even just regular folks, that are really good at getting a crowd to come in. A crowd does not mean we're going to get what we need. What we need is contained in this book. So, we're going to wrap it up here in just a couple of minutes while pointing out some of the things that are not commonly spoken of in meetings. Because we're going to look for this sufficient substitute in these pages, which we're not going to discuss all of those this morning. But if you'll do things in a certain way, then you'll experience a spiritual experience that takes the place of the drugs and alcohol. And it's so profound that it removes the need to use drugs and alcohol. It becomes your new religion, if you will. Your new spiritual experience that's so much better than the drugs or alcohol
that you would not think of going back to drugs and alcohol. It's not a fight. It's not a daily. You've actually replaced it with something much better. So that's what this book is designed to do, is to not set you back in the sober hour, but to give you power that is so significant, and spirituality that is so significant that you can deal with anything that alcohol could deal with the same serenity and comfort, and change those feelings the same way. And we're going to emphasize that point here a little bit. And you might ask yourself, well, why is he reading this stuff? Well, I'll emphasize. These are just things that are left out of AA meetings around the world. For example, on page 11, first paragraph, it says, "To Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man." When was the last time you heard somebody talk about this paragraph in a meeting? Never. It was not too closely followed by those who claimed it. Those are those second-handers we're talking about. Once you get a good thing going, you have your second-hand people they want to join the club. So, it goes on to say, "His moral teaching most excellent. For myself, I had adopted the parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded." So this means Bill Wilson had read the Bible. He believed in Christ. His teachings were most excellent. Loved all that stuff. And it also tells us a little bit about what happened. He adopted the parts which seemed convenient, and he disregarded the rest. Well, isn't that exactly what we're talking about happening with the Big Book now and Alcoholics Anonymous? We adopt the parts which seem convenient, and we disregard the rest.
That's why they invented highlighters.
Yeah. I'll adopt this part. I've got it. Now, in our meetings, we'll go in and, you hear the topics. There's a few topics that are popular worldwide. These are the topics. Well, what we're going to do differently here is we're not going to adopt the parts of the Big Book that seem convenient, and we're not going to disregard the rest. We're going to get the whole thing. Now, as we roll on down to the bottom of page 11, at this moment I want to emphasize we're on page 11 of the book. We're not deep in the book and this is some hidden information. We're on page 11. It's kind of letting us know where we're heading. Okay? This bottom paragraph says, "Though that floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. Here was something at work in a human heart which had done the impossible. My ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Never mind the musty past. Here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great tidings." Page 11, we've already said it began to look as though religious people were right after all. "To Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man." Well, that gives you a good idea of, we could go through portion after portion of the Big Book of topics that are critical. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say that, whenever it talks about this on page 11, he's talked about Christ, and then he talks about it began to look as though religious people were right after all. I think that did a few things in my mind. One, it let me know that it's okay to have, it's okay to talk about a conception of God. One of my understanding, it's okay to talk about him like it says. I mean, Bill Wilson is talking about Christ right here. It also does another thing, and I totally went blank on what it was, but it does something else.
Alright.
But no, there was a couple of things that I realized the first time I read this. Whenever, I mean, it was just cool. Anyway.
Okay. So we're going to kind of summarize here. We've used up our time for today. To summarize is we've had a spiritual/religious experience. It's identified as a mystical spiritual experience. You can actually use that term because that's how it's identified by who? William James. What are his qualifications? He's the father of psychology. the father of psychology. So he's trying to let us know a long, long time ago what's up. So we've got to change our religion from being drugs and alcohol to another one that's a first-hand experience. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to do that using the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we're going to get every detail in there. We're going to understand it. We're going to embrace it. We're going to look at it as the authority for our method to have this spiritual experience. And everything else, there's a big world out there, a wonderful, great amount of literature and so forth. We've got clear-cut instructions in this Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous on how to have this spiritual experience. So let's wrap up this meeting by reading the promises on page 85. They're a little different than the 9th step promises. These are the 10th step promises. And this is what we can expect to happen. Actually, it's at the bottom of 84. This last paragraph on 84, it says, "We have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol. For by this time sanity will have returned. We will seldom be interested in liquor. If tempted, we recoil from it as from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally, and we will find all this has happened automatically. We will see that our new attitude towards liquor has been given us without any effort on our part. It just comes. That is the miracle of it. We're not fighting it, neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We've not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. We are neither cocky nor are we afraid. That is our experience. That is how we react so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition."
Thanks, dude.
You are welcome. Let's say the Lord's Prayer.
Sorry.
We are going to do the hug thing.
Oh, okay.
That way, whoever's got a cold doesn't give it to the next guy.
Right here. Yeah, I've got it.
Get on in here, Cole.
Get it, man. One,
Oh, come on, God will protect us.
can't do
Have faith.
How are we gonna? Okay.
Come on, let's just make some scooch.
Jeff Mike stepping up.
Jeff Mike stepping up. All right. Who's your daddy?
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Keep coming back, it works when you work it.
Yes, on this grind.
And you guys know.
On the board, you'll notice it talks about religious experiences. Gotta get all the I's dotted here. Religious experiences. There's a lot of misunderstanding in our program about what the Big Book is about. There's a lot of times you'll go into a meeting and they'll say, well, this is not a religion. This is a spiritual program. Not a religious program. It's a spiritual program. Well, that's true to a degree. However, there are many, many places throughout the Big Book, starting on page 11, that it talks about religion. And we really kind of need to come to terms with that. Now, religion comes from a word, ligio, which is a Latin word for read. It means to read. Religio means